Welcome to Medieval Europe 4, Post-Plague Europe on the eve of Atlantic exploration and the Renaissance. This is Professor Klein. This is a lecture overview of the entire lecture. As you can see with the key terms and concepts for this lecture, lots of stuff going on here. One of the key elements after the Great Plague was the social, economic, and political upheavals of the time. This is going to make available in some areas, such as in Florence, the Republic of Florence, the rise of wealthy families through trade and merchant ventures. And this is going to be the Medici family. In reaction to the times, we're going to have individuals like Machiavelli writing The Prince, cities being repopulated, exploration in the 13th century by Marco Polo into China, and people are going to react to the labor prices. They're going to revolt, and it's important for you to read the examples in regards to France and England, what we have here. Renaissance literature, Dante, Chaucer, these are two that I want you to be familiar with. And then, of course, art and architecture, Michelangelo, and then Brunelleschi. Key to this time, the Renaissance, would be humanism. So be familiar with this as well. By the mid-14th century, Europe was overpopulated. Urban cities and country towns were filthy places with garbage, human and animal waste piled up in the streets, which became breeding ground for disease and death. The plague, as we now know it, spread out of Central Asia during a time of trade and peace, called the Mongolian Peace, a 100-year economic revival of the Silk Route, connecting Asia and Europe in trade and purchase of luxury commodities from China and India, previously controlled by Muslim traders and bandits. All the while, the period of 1200 to 1500, known as the High Middle Ages, was a time of unusual progress. Cities in northern Italy, in particular, benefited from the reopening of the Silk Route by the Mongols, and secondly, the growth of maritime trade, promoting a healthy commercial seaport trade in the Mediterranean. Venice and Genoa were major seaport cities from where merchant sea captains acquired skills and spices that had arrived in Constantinople and Alexandria from Arab and Turkish traders. Marco Polo returned from 17 years as a trading visitor, not allowed to freely leave Kublai Khan's Mongol court, but after a time he was able to do this. After he did return to Venice in 1295, few of his contemporaries believed of his travels. Genoa rivaled Venice in seaport trade, monopoly of Asian luxuries. Genoese merchants established colonies around the Black Sea. In Northern Europe, a trading association was created called the Hanseatic League, a third area of trade including trading in wool and manufactured centers that would develop in what we would know as present-day Belgium, where skilled artisans produced fine woolen cloth appealing to Europeans who formerly paid high prices for Asian silk. When 30 to 50% of Europeans died during the Black Plague of the 14th century, this greatly impacted Europe's trade and economics and was accompanied by social unrest and rebellion. After the plague, European society revolted in cities and in the countryside. One of the biggest problems was a serious shortage of labor. This affected a dramatic increase in the price of labor. At the same time, the cost of food and livestock was inflated. The landed elite responded to paying higher wages by attempting to regulate or hold down wages by instituting new laws. In 1351, the English Parliament passed a law to this effect to set wages at pre-plague levels and limit peasant mobility. This was responded to in revolt. In 1358, French peasants in the north orchestrated a revolt as well. Peasants were angered by growing class tensions. Landed aristocrats wanted to retain their political power, but in a time of high wages, they looked upon the peasants with contempt. The Renaissance was a cultural movement that profoundly affected European intellectual life in the early modern period. Beginning in Italy and spreading to the rest of Europe by the 16th century, its influence was felt in literature, philosophy, art, politics, science, religion, and other aspects of intellectual inquiry. Renaissance scholars employed the humanist method in study and searched for realism and human emotion in art. Renaissance thinkers sought out learning from ancient texts, typically written in Latin or ancient Greek. Scholars scoured Europe's monastic libraries, searching for works of antiquity which had fallen into obscurity. The city of Florence emerged in the late 14th century as a center of banking, fine wool cloth production, and artisan crafts protected by strong guilds run by master craftsmen. The banking dynasty in the 14th century was dominated by one group, the Medici family. The Republic was founded by a small group of wealthy merchants known as an oligarchy who manipulated the Republican-style government to benefit their own commercial and family interests. Renaissance political power could not have been expressed better than through the efforts and literary tradition of The Prince by Machiavelli. After the Medici family had lost its political power, Machiavelli witnessed numerous changes in Florence's city government. As a political diplomat, he was preoccupied with keeping political power intact. Machiavelli's major concerns in The Prince were the following: acquisition, expansion, and maintenance of political power as a means to restore and maintain order in his time. Dante Alighieri was an Italian poet born in Florence to an ancient family. His work, The Divine Comedy, is widely considered a central epic poem of Italian literature and the first great work of the Renaissance. Geoffrey Chaucer was an English author, poet, philosopher, and is remembered for the Canterbury Tales. Sometimes credited with being the first author to demonstrate the artistic legitimacy of the vernacular English language rather than French or Latin. Renaissance humanism was a European intellectual movement beginning in 14th century Florence. By the mid-15th century, humanism described a curriculum comprising grammar, rhetoric, moral philosophy, poetry, and history. The overriding goal of humanists who valued reason and evidence of the senses as ways of reaching the truth over Christian values of humility, introspection, and passivity, which had dominated European thought in previous centuries, was to become eloquent in rhetoric. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery of ancient scientific texts was accelerated after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the invention of printing, which would democratize learning and allow a faster propagation of new ideas. As you can see here, the Renaissance included scientific inquiry, chemistry, astronomy, geography, art, architecture, and many others. Please read your lecture notes for details.